form said specimen V11, draconic subclassification, albino variant, age estimated juvenile to subadult, origin unknown, status unclaimed, duration in holding 11 months, 4 days. I read it twice in the break room with my coffee still in my hand. Standing beside the printed roster that facility director Owen had left on the counter before she caught the early transit out. The roster had 12 names on it. 11 of them had lines through them. 3 vets, 2 junior techs, the overnight observation specialist, and 4 of the 5 animal care aides had been transferred, reassigned, or let go when the Solith Transit Hub restructured its budget allocation for the 3rd time in 2 years. What remained of the holding clinic staff was me, a part-time data clerk named Suri, who came in Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and a maintenance contract for the air filtration units. The form said, at the bottom, in Owen's handwriting, "Kale, this one's yours now. Sorry." He bites. I finish my coffee. I rinse the cup. I went to find pen 11. The Solith Transit Hub sits at the junction of 3 contested border corridors in a system that nobody owns cleanly, and everybody claims loudly. It was built 40 years ago as a freightway station, expanded twice into a passenger terminal, and then expanded again when the Verith sovereignty opened the border for non-citizen transit, and the interspecies holding facility became a practical necessity rather than a theoretical one. We processed sick or injured draconic passengers who couldn't complete transit on their own, abandoned hatchlings found in cargo holds, the occasional elder who'd had a medical event mid-journey and needed stabilization. Most of them moved on within weeks. Some stayed longer. A few left us in ways nobody discussed at morning briefing. I had been at Soleth for 6 years. Before that, 11 years at the Kethmora Veterinary Station on the Outer Belt, and before that 14 years in mixed practice on a frontier settlement that no longer existed, lost in the same border renegotiation that had made the corridor system necessary in the first place. 31 years in draconic veterinary work totals itself up into a kind of professional sediment, a weight of accumulated hours that isn't wisdom, exactly, but is something practical that functions like it. You learn to read crest posture before you read vocalization. You learn that an animal in distress doesn't necessarily look distressed by any measure that a layperson would recognize, that sometimes distress looks like stillness, like refusal, like the complete evacuation of interest in the world around it. You learn that non-viable is a diagnosis that requires the person who writes it to have been patient enough and slow enough and present enough, and that sometimes the conditions of veterinary practice don't allow for any of those things, and that is a systemic problem and not a moral failing, and that understanding this does not stop you from wanting to fix it when you have the chance. I had 31 years of that kind of sediment and no illusions about it. I was not a remarkable practitioner. I was a thorough one, and in my experience, the two qualities are not as related as people tend to assume. Specimen V11 had been here 11 months, 4 days. That was, in my 31 years of veterinary practice, a number I had never seen next to an unclaimed draconic patient. The average stay for an unclaimed juvenile was 8 to 12 weeks before a sovereignty representative collected them. After that, there was a legal process: identification, lineage confirmation, clan assignment. Juveniles without lineage confirmation went into a sovereignty resettlement program. It was bureaucratic and slow and sometimes unkind, but it moved. 11 months without a claim, without a collection, without even a lineage inquiry. That was something I hadn't encountered before. I went to find pen 11 and tried not to read too much into the number. The holding pens were in the lower level, where the filtered air came in cold and the light was full spectrum artificial, calibrated to mid-morning regardless of what the actual sky was doing above us. The facility had been designed with draconic physiology in mind. The ceilings were high, the pens wide, the gate mechanisms built for minimal noise. Most of the pens were empty now. Budget cuts had reduced the census from 22 patients to 9, and 3 of those were due for collection within the week. The corridor smelled of industrial disinfectant, and the dry, mineral-tinged scent that draconic skin produces when it's underhydrated. Not bad exactly, but a kind of background signal that told you something needed attention. Pen 11 was at the far end. I could see him before I reached the gate. He was in the corner farthest from the door, which was where the lighting was weakest. Not dark, but less insistent. He had pressed himself into the angle where two walls met and was watching me come. His eyes were pale gold, almost colorless in the artificial light. His scales were the color of ash left in a cold fireplace, not white, not gray. Something in between that shifted when he moved, catching the overhead lights in a way that made it hard to hold his shape in focus. He was small. For a juvenile draconic of the subadult classification, he was very small. His ridge crests ran from behind his eye sockets to the base of his neck in a double line, pale as the rest of him, and they were flat, pressed down, which in draconic body language is not aggression but something quieter and more difficult to work with. It means, I have decided you are not worth the energy of a threat. That is in its own way harder to treat than open hostility. I stood at the gate for a while. I didn't open it. He watched me. He didn't move. I went back to the supply room, found the temperature probe and the hydration assessment kit, checked the feeding log. 3 consecutive missed meals, and before that, 4 meals taken but logged at minimal intake, barely maintenance level, and came back to pen 11 with a portion of the supplemental protein, paste that we used for patients who wouldn't take solid food. I sat down on the floor outside the gate with my back against the corridor wall and opened the container and waited. He didn't come to the gate. I waited 20 minutes. He didn't come. I closed the container, capped it, set it just inside the gate where he could reach it without coming close to me, and went to do the rest of the morning rounds. He didn't eat it. I came back at the end of the shift. The container was where I'd left it. He was in the same corner. I sat down outside the gate again, and this time I brought the morning's data entries to file on my tablet, because there was no point in staring at him and making it a thing. I sat and did my filing, and he sat in his corner, and we occupied the same general stretch of corridor without interacting, and after 40 minutes I got up, retrieved the untouched container, and went home. I did this for 9 days. The other patients got their rounds, their assessments, their medications. 3 of them were discharged in that period. 2 hatchlings collected by a sovereignty liaison. 1 adult female who had recovered sufficiently from the thoracic injury that had brought her in 3 weeks prior to resume transit. The facility's census went down to 6. The corridor got quieter. I found myself spending more of my between rounds time at the supply room end of the lower level, closer to pen 11. For no particular reason I was willing to name in the log. On the 6th day, I brought a different food preparation. Not the standard protein paste, but a reduced protein, higher mineral blend that was technically indicated for patients with suspected gut motility disruption. Long-term food refusal can cause a secondary shutdown of digestive function in draconic juveniles. And while I didn't know the extent of V11's prior intake history before my time, 11 months with a flagged feeding record suggested the risk was worth hedging. I set the container inside the gate in the same way and sat against the wall and filed my reports. He didn't eat it that day either. But the next morning, when I checked, the container had been moved. Not emptied, moved perhaps 2 feet from where I'd placed it, which meant he'd at minimum approached it. He'd smelled it. He'd chosen not to eat it yet. That was information, not much, but some. I went back to the standard paste on day 8 and left the mineral blend as a second option, smaller portion, set closer to the gate. On day 9, the standard paste was untouched, but the mineral blend was half empty. On the 10th day, he moved. Not toward me. He didn't come anywhere near the gate. He shifted position. He moved from the far corner to the middle of the pen and lay down facing the gate. And he watched me file reports with his pale gold eyes half open and his ridge crests still flat. But his tail, which had been tucked tight against his body every previous morning, was lying loose on the floor beside him. That was something. I didn't make a production of it. I noted it in the log, Patient changed resting position, tail posture more relaxed, and I kept filing my reports. And at the end of the shift, I put the capped container of protein paste just inside the gate and went home. In the morning, it was empty and pushed to the side of the pen. So he was eating. He just didn't want me to see him do it. I could work with that. Over the next 2 weeks, I adjusted the approach. I started bringing 2 containers. One that I put inside the gate as I came in, before I sat down, so he could eat while I was there without it being about me watching him eat. And one that I held onto and ate from myself during the 40 minutes, because I'd started timing my lunch break to the end of shift visit. And it seemed only reasonable to eat while he ate, even if neither of us was making eye contact about it. I had a thermos. I brought the kind of lunch that didn't require much attention. Something I could manage with one hand, while the other held the tablet. He ate his paste. I ate my sandwich. We did not acknowledge each other. After 3 days of this, he moved closer to the gate. Not to it, maybe halfway across the pen from where he'd been lying. He lay down there and ate his paste, and I ate my sandwich, and neither of us made a thing of it. His scales, I noticed up close, were not actually uniform. The ash pale base was overlaid with a very faint reticulation, a net pattern of slightly lighter lines, like frost on glass, visible only when the light hit them at a certain angle. His ridge crests, when fully extended, which I hadn't seen, because they were always flat when I was present, would have run nearly 12 centimeters above the roofline of the crest itself, which for a specimen his size was disproportionately large. That suggested bloodline markers, something old and dense in the breeding line. I noted it and filed it and didn't think too hard about what it implied, because bloodline speculation without documentation is veterinary gossip, and I'd never had much patience for gossip. I did start calling him Ash, not to his face at first, just in my own notes, the unofficial ones I kept in the margins of the patient log, where I wrote observations that didn't fit the intake form's categories. Ash, because of the color of him in the morning light. Because it was easier than writing V11 every time I needed to distinguish his notes from the general record. I don't know exactly when I started saying it out loud. Somewhere around the 3rd week, probably. I'd come in and open the supply room and say something like, "Morning, Ash, paste is in," and then go in and put his portion down and come back out and sit against the wall. He would watch me say it. His ridge crests didn't move, but they were flat in a different way. Not the press down, "You are not worth a threat" flat, but something I'd started mentally categorizing as wait and see flat, which is not the same thing at all. In the 5th week, he came to the gate. He didn't come through it. He came to within about 30 centimeters of the bars and lay down there, which put him close enough that if I'd reached through, I could have touched him, which I did not do. I sat against the opposite wall and ate my sandwich, and he lay at the gate and ate his paste, and his pale gold eyes watched me with an expression learned enough draconic physiology to read as something between assessment and grudging tolerance. And that was a very long way from where we'd started. I noted it in the log. Changed resting position to gate proximate. Patient initiating proximity contact on own terms. The data clerk Suri came in on Tuesday and read the recent entries and said, "You've got him moving. Specialist Verith Clinic said he was non-viable." I said that non-viable was a diagnosis I'd seen revised before. Suri said, "He bites." I said he hadn't bitten me yet. Suri said Owen's note specifically said he bites. I said I knew about Owen's note. Suri filed her reports and left. I went to have my end-of-shift lunch with Ash. The biting question got answered in week 7, not the way Suri had been predicting. I was doing the weekly physical assessment, temperature probe, hydration check, scale condition, respiratory function, and Ash had allowed me inside the pen for this since week 5, which was itself a development I'd logged carefully, because a non-viable juvenile allowing a handler inside the pen unsupervised is not a small thing. He submitted to the temperature probe without incident. He tolerated the hydration check. When I got to the scale condition assessment, which requires handling, Lifting segments of scale plate to check the underlying skin for moisture and lesion, he held still for the first 4 checkpoints and then at the 5th snapped. Not at me. He snapped at the air to his left, about 40 centimeters from my hand, with a sound like a closing door, and then held still again. A warning. A very precisely calibrated warning, delivered to a point in empty space with enough precision that it couldn't have been accidental. He was telling me something. I stopped the assessment and looked at where he'd snapped, and found a section of scale plate along his left lateral flank that was sitting at the wrong angle, not broken, but torqued, the underlying plate having shifted from where it should have articulated. It would have been tender, probably had been tender for some time. I sat back. I said, "All right, I see it. We'll leave that one today." He looked at me. I said, "I'm going to need to come back to it eventually, but not today. Today, we leave it." His ridge crests did something I hadn't seen before. They didn't rise, they tilted, the leading edge of each crest angling fractionally forward, which is a movement associated in the draconic literature with a posture called, and the translation is approximate, attending with intent. It means, I am listening to what you just said and I am considering whether it is true. I left it for the day. I noted the displaced plate in the log and scheduled a corrective assessment for the following week with a note that the patient required advance notice and a slower approach at that site. I came back 3 days later and spent 20 minutes sitting outside the pen, not going in, just being there, before I went in and approached the lateral flank slowly and said, "This is the one I need to look at. I'll be quick." He was still for the whole assessment. The plate had shifted further. It needed manual correction, which is a procedure that requires sedation in most cases, but which I'd learned over 30 years could sometimes be managed without it if the patient was sufficiently calm and the handler sufficiently slow. We managed it without sedation. It took 40 minutes. When it was done, Ash put his head down on the pen floor and made a sound I hadn't heard before. Low, continuous, not quite a vibration, something between a hum and a resonance that I could feel in my back teeth if I sat still enough. I logged it as post-procedure vocalization, novel type, possible comfort indicator, duration, ongoing. I sat on the pen floor for another hour while he made the sound, because it seemed like the thing to do. The wing came in week 9, which surprised me more than anything else had. I had been working from the intake documentation, which noted, right wing membrane incomplete, suspected genetic deficit, non-functional. The note was marked as confirmed by 2 separate specialists before my time on the case. I had no reason to question it. When I did the intake physical, I'd assessed the right side and found the membrane folded. Not absent, folded, which can look the same to a quick examination, and made a note to re-examine when the patient was more settled. I hadn't re-examined because there were always other things to do first, and because a non-functional wing was not the priority when the patient was refusing to eat. In week 9, Ash stood up. He'd been lying at the gate as usual when I arrived with the morning's paste, and I'd come in and set it down and sat against the wall with my tablet. And then somewhere around the 20-minute mark, he stood up and stretched in the way that draconic juveniles do when they've been lying still for a long time. Hindquarters first, then forequarters, then a full body extension that runs from the crest ridge to the tail tip, and the right wing came out. It was intact, not incomplete, not vestigial, fully membraned. The connective webbing running from the leading spar to the trailing edge without a gap, the membrane itself thinner than the left wing. Paler, more translucent. You could see the light through it at the edges, but structurally present, and as far as I could assess from where I was sitting, functional. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "That's not in the record." Ash looked at me. He folded the wing back and went to his paste. I went and re-examined the right wing in the next day's assessment, properly this time, with the equipment I needed. The membrane was thinner than standard, the leading spar lighter in density, but the articulation points were sound and the range of motion, tested carefully with the patient's permission, which he granted after 2 failed. attempts and a 20-minute break between them, was within normal parameters for a juvenile of his estimated age. Not a flight-capable wing on its own, not yet, maybe not ever at its current density, but not absent, not non-functional. I filed a correction to the intake record. Specialist notation: right wing membrane assessed as intact on re-examination. Previous documentation in error. I sent a copy to the regional draconic health office as required by protocol and received an automated acknowledgement and nothing further. I went back and sat with Ash and told him his file was going to need some serious updating. He made the low resonance sound. I took that as agreement. Around week 10, I started bringing a book, not the tablet, a physical book, the kind with pages, because I'd found that the page-turning sound seemed to interest Ash in a way that the tablet's silence didn't. He would watch the page turn with his ridge crests at the attending with intent angle, and his pale gold eyes tracking the motion. And occasionally he would put his head down on the pen floor about an arm's length from where I was sitting, which was close enough that I could hear the resonance sound starting if I stayed quiet. I read 3 books in Pen 11 that month. I don't remember what any of them were about. I remember the light coming through the ventilation slats at the end of each shift, going amber at the edges the way artificial light does when the system cycles toward evening mode. I remember Ash's scales doing something interesting in that light, the frost glass reticulation coming up more clearly, the pale base deepening slightly toward a silver that was almost luminous. I remember thinking that whoever had logged him as non-viable had done their job very quickly, and probably on a full caseload and probably under pressure, and that non-viable at 11 months wasn't the same thing as non-viable in week 10 with the right kind of patience applied. I noted in the log, patient tolerating close proximity, vocalization, comfort type increasing in frequency, recommend continued daily contact protocol. There was nobody to recommend it to but myself, but the note seemed important to have on record. In week 11, I came in on a Thursday morning, Suri's day, which meant I could hear the data terminal running in the admin office down the corridor, and found Ash standing at the gate waiting, not lying down, standing, which he'd started doing when he heard me coming, though I hadn't said anything about it in the log, because I didn't want to weight it with more significance than it might carry. He watched me come down the corridor, and his ridge crests were up, not the flat pressing down of the first days, not the attending with intent tilt. Fully extended, the full 12 centimeters, all 6 crests on each ridgeline, angled slightly forward, which in the draconic literature is associated with a posture that doesn't have a clean human transition, but which the closest approximation renders as recognized. I said, "Good morning, Ash." He made the resonance sound before I'd even got my keycard to the gate. Suri came out of the admin office and watched me open the gate and go in and put down the paste, and she said, "He's different." I said he'd been working on it. She said, "You know Director Owen is going to want a full case review when she gets back from the allocation conference." She flagged V11 as a potential resource liability. I said I knew. She said, "A resource liability means they're going to look at whether continued holding is justifiable." I said I understood what it meant. She went back to the admin office. I sat on the pen floor with my book. Ash lay down beside me, not close enough to touch, but close enough that the resonance carried through the floor when it started, a warmth that came up through the concrete and settled somewhere behind my ribs. I thought about resource liability assessments and what they tended to mean for long-term unclaimed patients, and I decided that I was going to have a very thorough and well-documented case review ready for Owen's return, and that the documentation was going to include every updated assessment, every corrected notation, every logged development since the day I'd taken the file. I went home that Thursday and stayed up until midnight doing it. The case file, fully updated, ran to 31 pages. I called it Patient V11, Common Name Ash, Review and Status Update. Month 3 of Current Care Protocol. The translator unit in Pen 11 had been running since intake, standard protocol. logging any vocalizations the patient produced in case they resolved into parsable language. The unit's output up to week 9 had been no parsable content, vocalization type unclassified, which was consistent with what the previous staff had noted. The sound Ash made didn't map to any of the translator's known draconic dialect registers. In week 12, the translator flagged a partial match, not to a dialect, to a sound pattern classified in the translator's database as archaic Vasith register, ceremonial subdialect, high lineage formal mode. Confidence, 31%. 31% is not a high confidence match. It's the kind of match that, in a well-staffed facility with a linguistics specialist on roster, would generate a conversation at morning briefing and probably a consultation requests to the regional sovereignty language office. In a facility with one vet tech and a part-time data clerk, it generated a note in my margin log. Translator flagged partial. Archaic Vaseth? Check regional registry. I sat with the output for a while before I checked anything. The translator unit had never flagged Ash's vocalizations as parsable before. 11 weeks of logging and every output had been no parsable content, vocalization type unclassified. A 31% match on an archaic ceremonial register was not nothing. Archaic registers, as I understood from the limited draconic linguistics I'd absorbed over 31 years of clinical practice, don't appear in isolation. They're embedded in lineage. The reason a register becomes archaic is that the bloodline that carried it contracts or disperses or ends. A 31% partial match on high lineage formal mode in a juvenile with unconfirmed origin. After 11 months of vocalizations the standard translator couldn't categorize, was the kind of coincidence that a thorough practitioner files. So I filed it. The archaic Vasith register was documented as a dialect associated with the founding bloodlines of the Vasith Keth clan, a lineage that the regional registry listed as status unconfirmed, last known representative believed lost in transit, inquiry ongoing under Vareth sovereignty jurisdiction. Inquiry ongoing. I sat with that for a while. Then I sent a copy of the translator flag, with the patient file number and the 31% confidence notation, to the Regional Draconic Language Office, to the Vareth Sovereignty Regional Inquiry Desk, and to the Transit Hub's Administrative Office, because that was what the protocol said to do with unclassified vocalizations that generated a partial match on a heritage register. I got an automated acknowledgement from the language office and nothing from the others. I went back to Pen 11 and told Ash I'd sent some paperwork. He was lying by the gate. His crests were at the attending with intent angle. When I sat down, he shifted, so his head was about 20 centimeters from my knee, closer than he'd been before, and the resonance sound started almost immediately, low enough that I felt it more than heard it. I read my book. He made his sound. The evening light came through the ventilation slats. That was a Wednesday. On the Thursday, Suri came in and found my notification on the outbound log and came to find me in the supply room. She said, "You sent a flag to the Sovereignty Inquiry Desk." I said yes, she said, on a 31% match. I said that 31% on an archaic heritage register was worth filing under protocol. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "Kale, the Vasith Keth inquiry has been open for 11 months. The Sovereignty has had 2 legal specialists and a full inquiry team working it. If this is what they think it might be," I said, "then they'll follow up or they won't." I sent the file number. They have what they need. She went back to the admin office. I went back to the rounds. The day passed. 2 patients were discharged, the adult male with the healing tympanic injury and the elderly female whose respiratory function had stabilized. The corridor got quieter. The census was down to 4. On the following Tuesday, Suri came in and found a message from the Sovereignty Regional Office requesting the patient's full file history. Not a form letter, a direct inquiry signed by a named official. The message was time-stamped 4 days after my notification, which meant they had responded within hours of receiving it, and the message had been in the queue over the weekend. I pulled the file. It now ran to 23 pages, counting all the updated assessments and corrected notations. I sent it. I got an acknowledgement the same afternoon, which was faster than any administrative response I'd received from a sovereignty office in 6 years at Solith. I noted it and kept doing rounds. There was nothing else to do. The file said what it said. Either it was what the registry suggested it might be, or it wasn't. And in either case, Ash still needed his morning paste and his weekly assessment, and somebody in the room at the end of the shift. Outside the Solith Transit Hub, apparently several things were happening that I wasn't aware of. I learned this later, not from any official communication, but from the account given to me afterward by a sovereignty representative named Veth Solara, who was a junior member of the delegation and who seemed to feel that I should understand the full context. I'm setting it down here as she described it, because it's part of the record even if I wasn't in it. 11 months and 2 weeks before the morning I found Ash's file on the counter, a transport vessel registered to the Verith Sovereignty had suffered a catastrophic navigational failure in the border corridor transit and had broken up over a debris field. The vessel had been carrying among its passengers a juvenile draconic of the Vasith Keth founding bloodline, the last confirmed heir of a lineage that predated the sovereignty's current governmental structure by several centuries, a lineage whose continuity was, in ways that I didn't fully understand and still don't entirely, constitutionally significant to the sovereignty's legal framework. Not ceremonially significant, actually, legally, structurally significant. Search and recovery had found the wreckage and most of the passengers. The juvenile had not been among the recovered. The recovery team had concluded, after thorough search, that the juvenile had not survived. The sovereignty had opened an inquiry, not a public one, but a formal internal process, to confirm the absence of any heir and to initiate the legal procedures that would follow. The inquiry had been working its way through the transit hub network on the border corridor, checking draconic holding facilities, checking cargo manifests, checking every point in the system where an injured juvenile might have been brought in from a debris field without clear documentation of origin. They had been working inward from the outer corridor nodes. Solith Hub was not the largest station on the corridor, nor the closest to the wreckage site. It was the 4th node they'd scheduled, and their inquiry team had been delayed twice by administrative complications at the first 2. My notification, the translator flag, the patient file number, had reached the Sovereignty Inquiry Desk 9 days before the delegation arrived at Solith Hub. I don't know what happened when it did. Veth Solara said there was significant activity at the sovereignty administrative level. I can imagine what that means. I couldn't have imagined it at the time because I didn't know any of this and was thinking primarily about Ash's plate displacement healing correctly and whether his right wing spar was gaining density on the expected curve. What I knew in week 13 was that Ohen had sent a message from the allocation conference saying she'd been contacted by the regional office about a sovereignty inquiry and that she was extending her trip by 2 days to attend a briefing and that I should make sure the facility was in order for a possible delegation visit. I cleaned the corridor. I updated all the active patient files. I made sure the gate mechanisms were oiled. I stocked the supply room. I told Ash that we might have visitors. He looked at me from the gate, where he'd been standing waiting when I arrived, which was his habit now. His crests were fully extended, the 12 centimeters of pale ridgeline bright in the morning light. He'd grown, I noted, not dramatically, but measurably. The weight logs showed consistent gain over the past 6 weeks. The hydration assessments were within normal range. The displaced plate had healed cleanly. The right wing, on last assessment, showed a 7% increase in leading spar density, which was modest but real. He was, in the language of the intake form I'd been handed 11 months ago, no longer non-viable. I said, "We've done some good work." He made the resonance sound and went to eat his breakfast. The delegation arrived at the Solith Transit Hub on the 48th day of the 3rd month of my tenure as sole practitioner of the holding clinic. I know the exact date because I'd put it in the log. I know the time because I was asleep in pen 11 when they came. I want to explain how that happened because it sounds worse than it was, and because it's the part of the story that got retold afterward in ways that weren't entirely accurate. Before the delegation arrived, Ash had been restless, not distressed. His crest posture was not alarm flat, and his tail was loose, not tucked, but restless in the way that patients sometimes get when they're picking up on something in the environment before it becomes legible to human senses. Infrasound, pressure changes, chemical signals in the ventilation. Draconic sensory apparatus runs wider than human, and they respond to things we don't know are there yet. I'd sat with him through the evening and into the late shift, not because anything was wrong, but because he was restless, and my presence seemed to settle him. And at some point between the late shift and the early morning, I had fallen asleep against the pen wall, with my book in my hand and Ash lying about, an arm's length away, and the resonance sound humming through the concrete floor. When I woke up, the pen gate was open. I'd left it unlatched when I came in the previous evening. This was not standard practice, but Ash had started pushing the gate with his nose, and I'd been testing the unlatch as a measure of trust, letting him have the option of the corridor without making it a supervised event. He'd never gone through it before. I'd noted the behavior in the log and flagged it as a patient confidence indicator. He'd gone through it now. He was standing in the corridor outside the pen, which I discovered when I opened my eyes and found the gate open and no dragon in the pen. I got up, fast, and looked out into the corridor, and he was there, not at the far end, not headed for the exit, but standing about 3 meters from the pen gate in the middle of the corridor with his crests fully extended and his tail held level, which is a standing posture I'd never seen from him, alert, formal almost, in the way draconic body language has formalities that you learn to read only after a long time watching. The delegation was at the far end of the corridor, 7 of them, 7 ancient draconic, each one a slate and gold coloring so uniform it read as a uniform, each one large enough that the holding clinic corridor was barely wide enough for them to walk abreast. They had come in from the hub's main access bay, which meant someone in the administrative office had processed their arrival and opened the facility. Suri, I guessed, because it was a Thursday morning and Suri came in on Thursdays. The lead dragon was ahead of the others by half a step and was looking at Ash the way you look at something you've been searching for in a house for a long time and have finally found in the last room you checked. I was standing in the pen gate in yesterday's clothes, with my book under my arm and my hair approximately where it had been when I fell asleep. Ash looked back at the lead dragon. His crests came up to their full extension. All 6 on each ridgeline, the full 12 centimeters of pale crest angled forward in the recognized posture. The resonance sound he made was louder than I'd ever heard it, loud enough to feel it in my chest, not just my back teeth, and it carried a harmonic layer I hadn't heard before, something deeper underneath the familiar frequency, something that made the air in the corridor feel briefly different, the way air feels before a weather change. The lead dragon lowered its head. Not a small movement, a full deliberate lowering, the kind that in draconic body language carries enough weight that I'd only read descriptions of it, never seen it performed. The 6 behind it followed, 7 ancient slate and gold draconic, each one carrying more mass than the pen Ash had been living in, and they all lowered their heads. I stood in the pen gate and watched this happen. Ash turned and looked at me. His crests were still fully extended. His pale gold eyes caught the morning light from the ventilation slats and held it. Luminous, the way his scales went in that particular light, the frost glass pattern coming up bright and silver against the ash-pale base. He held the look for a moment. Then he turned back to the delegation and made the resonance sound again, and the lead dragon, the one who had lowered its head first, lifted its head and began to produce a sound in return. The translator unit in the corridor activated. The output read, match confirmed. Vasith Keth lineage marker, high confidence. Archaic ceremonial register, full pattern. I looked at the translator output screen for a while. Then I looked at the 7 ancient dragons in the corridor. Then at Ash. Then at the book I was still holding under my arm, which was a history of agricultural practices in the Solith border corridor, written in 2287 and extremely dry reading, and which I had brought from home because the page-turning sound interested him. The lead dragon spoke again. The translator produced text in 3 passes, because the archaic register required the longest processing time. This one carries the Vasith Keth lineage in full. We have searched 7 transit nodes. We came here last because this station was listed as minimal capacity. We did not expect to find what we came for here, I said. Right. The lead dragon's crest ridge moved in a pattern I didn't have in my reading. Then it said, through the translator, "You are the one who tended him." I said, "Yes," it said. "For how long?" I said, 13 weeks. He was here 11 months before that, but I got the assignment 13 weeks ago. It said, "He was not tended before you." I said, "He was." The previous staff were reassigned. I don't think it was. I thought about how to put it. I don't think anyone did anything wrong. It was a staffing situation. Budget allocation. It's been a difficult 2 years for the facility. The translator rendered this. The lead dragon was still for a long moment. Then it said, "He would not eat." I said, "For a while, he got there." The lead dragon said, "He would not allow proximity contact." I said, "That took some time too." Another pause. The other 6 dragons in the corridor had not moved. Ash had moved during this exchange. He had come back along the corridor and was standing about a meter to my left, which was closer than he'd ever been to me while standing, and his crests were still fully extended. I was aware, in a way I hadn't been during the first shock of finding them in the corridor, of how large the delegation was. 7 ancient draconic is a fact that reads differently in a holding facility corridor than it does in a registry entry. Each one was a creature that had been alive for centuries. Each one had crest ridges, the color of old slate, marked with the gold that I now understood indicated active lineage connection. Not decorative, not pigment, but a biological marker of bloodline function that the draconic literature noted without fully explaining. The corridor smelled different with them in it. Not dangerous. There was no alarm signal in the air, no raised infrasound, but dense, layered. A compound of old presence that you felt somewhere in the chest before you understood it with the mind. They were looking at Ash the way you look at something you had been afraid you'd lost. The lead dragon said, "What did you do?" I said, "The job. Temperature logs, hydration checks, physical assessments when he'd allow them. I brought him his food and sat outside the gate. Eventually I came in. I found the wing. The right wing wasn't absent. It was folded. The previous documentation was incorrect. I corrected the intake record. I fixed a plate displacement in week 7. The translator processed this. The lead dragon made a sound that didn't produce translator output. I said, I called him Ash because of the color of him in the morning light. I didn't know his proper name. A long pause. The lead dragon said, "His lineage name is Vasith Ketharan. The short form within the clan is Aran. It means in the archaic register of his bloodline, the one who remains." I said, "That's a good name." The lead dragon said, "Yes, it was given before his birth, which is the tradition of the Vasith Keth line. It was given by the last elder of his bloodline, who did not survive to see him born." I said, I stood in the pen gate and thought about that for a moment. About a name given before a birth by someone who didn't survive to see it. About 11 months in holding, logged as unclaimed, and whatever that 11 months had been like before I got there. About the way Ash Arun had been pressed into the far corner on my first day, crests flat, not worth the energy of a threat. About protein paste in a capped container, not eaten. About 9 days of sitting outside a gate. About whatever he had been sitting with alone in the 11 months before I arrived that had brought him to that particular posture. The one who remains, I said. He's doing well. The plate displacement healed cleanly. The wing is gaining density. I've been logging the measurements. I'll put the full updated record together for you. His weight is up. Hydration is normal. All the assessments are within expected range for his age cohort. He's been, I thought about the right word. He's been working hard. The lead dragon said, "We can see that." I nodded. I looked at Arun, standing to my left with his crests up and the resonance sound going low enough now that it was more felt than heard, the way it had been through the pen floor on the nights I'd sat late. I said, "I'll need to update the file. The name, the lineage confirmation, the status change. I should also file a formal correction to the intake documentation. The non-viable designation needs to be cleared, the wing assessment corrected, and the blood panel results recategorized under the appropriate lineage code once I have the confirmation number from your office." The lead dragon produced the sound that didn't translate. Then it said, "We are not here to collect administrative paperwork," I said. "I know, but I'll still need to update the file." Another pause. Something passed between the 7 dragons in the corridor, a shift of crests, a low exchange of sounds that the translator didn't capture. Then the lead dragon said, "You kept him," without knowing who he was, without knowing what keeping him would mean. I said, "He was on the roster." The lead dragon said, "That is not why you kept him." I looked at the lead dragon for a moment. I thought about the 31-page case review I'd filed. I thought about Suri saying he bites, and the fact that he had bitten at the air very precisely to show me the place that hurt. I thought about the book I was still holding, its pages bent where I'd fallen asleep with my thumb in it, the one with the page-turning sound he liked. I said, "He needed the job done properly. That's all." The lead dragon was still for a long time. Then it lowered its head again. Not the full formal lowering, but a tilt, deliberate, clear, and held it. It said, through the translator, "We will tell you his name in the way it must be spoken. You should have it in the full form, not the short one." It said a word. The translator processed it in 4 stages, the longest delay I'd seen from the unit, and produced Vasith Keth Arun Kale. The lineage notation extended with a keeper designation. The last element is not translatable as a single term. The closest rendering is, and the one who kept the fire company while it was going out. I read the translator output twice. I said, "That's a long name." The lead dragon said, "Lineage names hold the record. The record now includes you." I looked at the name on the translator screen. I looked at Arun, who was still standing to my left, crests up, the resonance sound going. His pale gold eyes were on me. The frost glass reticulation on his scales was bright in the morning light. I said, I'll make sure the file reflects the full name." The lead dragon said, "He will remain in your care for the transition period, if you are willing. The sovereignty will send a formal representative within the week to begin the lineage confirmation documentation. Until that documentation is complete, his physical care should remain with the handler who knows his condition. That is protocol. It is also," it paused, the translator caught up. It said, "what he would choose. He has told us so." I said, "Right." I looked at Arun. He was looking at me. His crests were doing the attending with intent tilt. I said, "We'll be here." The transition period was 11 days. Veth Solara, who was the sovereignty representative sent ahead to begin the documentation process, was a young ancient. "Relatively young," she said, with what I came to understand was draconic dry humor, meaning approximately 200 years, which put her in the cohort that had grown up knowing Ash's bloodline as history rather than living relation. She was smaller than the 7 from the corridor, a lighter slate coloring, and she came to the clinic on the first morning with a documentation kit that had more forms in it than my entire filing cabinet, and sat in the admin office with Suri for 3 days while they worked through the lineage confirmation process. Arun, spent those 3 days mostly in the corridor outside his pen, which he'd claimed as territory in the way that draconic juveniles do when they're confident enough to expand their range. He'd go in to sleep, but the gate stayed open and he moved between the pen and the corridor freely, which was not strictly in accordance with the facility's patient management protocols, but which I had decided was a reasonable accommodation given the circumstances. Veth Solara came to find me on the 3rd evening, after Suri had gone home, and sat in the corridor outside Pen 11, not inside. because the delegation's protocol required that a formal boundary be maintained until the documentation was complete, though Arun seemed to regard this as somewhat beside the point and had spent an hour with his head resting on the floor approximately 30 centimeters from Vetsalara's forepaw, which was as close as the protocol allowed. She said, "May I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Why did you send the translator flag to the inquiry desk?" The confidence was only 31%. Most practitioners would not have filed a notification on a partial match. I said, "Protocol says file any partial match on a heritage register." She said, "Yes." "But most practitioners," I said, "it was on the protocol list. I follow the protocol list." She looked at me. Her crest ridge did something I'd learned to read as the draconic equivalent of a considered pause. She said, "You followed the protocol list for 11 months before you arrived," I said. "The previous practitioners followed it too. They just had a different caseload and different staffing levels. I got lucky. I was the only one here, and Ash was the most complex patient, so I had the time to give him." She said, "You gave him more than time." I said he needed the proper assessment. The intake documentation was incomplete. A non-viable determination without a full wing assessment and a correct plate survey isn't a proper assessment. It was an honest error under difficult conditions, but it still needed correcting. She was quiet for a while. She said, "The sovereignty will want to formally acknowledge your contribution to the continuity of the Vaseth-Keth lineage. There is a protocol for that as well," I said. "That's kind. I'd be grateful if the formal acknowledgement came in writing, because I'll want to update the patient file and I'll need a reference number." She made a sound that the small pocket translator she was carrying rendered as you say, but her crest ridge was doing something that I thought, from 3 months of reading Arun's crest movements, might be the draconic equivalent of a smile. She said, "The elder who lowered his head to you, that was Veth Korath. He is the senior living elder of the Vareth sovereignty. He does not lower his head." I said, "He seemed to." She said, "He did. That is the point." I didn't have anything to say to that. I sat in the corridor with my hands on my knees and thought about Veth Korath lowering his head and the 6 behind him following, and about Ash, Arun, standing to my left with his crests fully up, and about the translator screen reading Vaseth-Keth Arun Kale, the last element not translatable as a single term, and the one who kept the fire company while it was going out. I sat with that for a while. I was not a man given to making large things of small actions, and I had been telling myself for 13 weeks that what I was doing was the job: temperature logs, hydration checks, sitting outside a gate with a tablet and a sandwich. That was all it was. But there was a living mild draconic in the corridor 20 meters away who had been pressing himself into a corner with his crests flat when I first met him, and who was now standing with his full ridgeline up in a formal posture I'd only read descriptions of, making a sound that the translator classified as archaic ceremonial high lineage register. So perhaps it had been a little more than the job. Or perhaps the job had always been a little more than I had given it credit for. I found I didn't need to resolve that question. It was enough that Ash was where he was. It was enough that the file was updated. I went home that night and slept for 9 hours, which was the most I'd slept in one stretch since before Owen's note had appeared on the counter. On the morning of the 11th day, the documentation was complete. Veth Solara filed the last form, stamped the confirmation, and the lineage record of Vaseth-Keth Arun was formally entered into the sovereignty registry. Suri made a copy for the facility file. I made a copy for the patient record. The patient record now ran to 47 pages, including the 31-page review, the updated assessments, the corrected intake documentation, and the formal lineage confirmation with the reference number Veth Solara had promised. On the morning the delegation arrived to take custody for the formal transition to sovereignty care. Not immediately. Veth Solara explained that a transition protocol existed for high lineage patients, a period of adjustment under dual care before full handover, which would take several more weeks. I got to the clinic early. I brought 2 containers of paste, as usual. I sat outside the pen gate, as usual, and Arun came and lay down with his head about 20 centimeters from my knee, as usual, and the resonance sound started, as usual. I read a chapter of the new book I'd brought. The page-turning sound interested him, as it always did. After a while I said, "Vasith Keth Arun Kale. That's what the file says now." He made the resonance sound. "It's a long name for a patient record. I'm going to keep writing Ash in the margin notes if that's all right." He shifted. His head moved forward until it was resting, lightly, on my knee. I held still. I said, "Right." I turned the page. Veth Solara, which I would an hour later with the transition team, found us in that configuration and said nothing about it. She went to the admin office and began the day's documentation. The transition team set up their equipment in the corridor. Suri arrived and made coffee and brought me a cup without being asked. I stayed where I was, with the book open and the weight of Arun's head on my knee and the resonance sound going low enough that I felt it more than heard it, and I read until the morning light through the ventilation slats shifted to midday, and the day's first formal assessments were due. Then I handed the cup back to Suri, closed the book, and went to start the rounds. Ash was still on the roster. He still needed his morning check. The name at the top of the page was different now, and the lineage column had more in it than it had before, and there were 7 additional contact entries under the Care Networks section. But the temperature probe still needed running, the hydration check still needed doing, and the weight log wasn't going to update itself. I wrote the date at the top of the new entry, noted the time, and started the assessment. Vasith Keth Arun Kale, patient V11, common name Ash, day 93 of current care protocol, status, ongoing.